got to say, when they invited me 2 months ago, you know, the whole deception and politics thing wasn't that big of a deal. And now, to talk about politics and deception in the presidential campaign, this is like the easiest speaking gig I've ever had. I just say those words and I'm done, you know? So there's been a ton of concern about deception and trustworthiness. Can everybody hear me okay in the back? Everybody seems fine? So. Okay, I'll stay near this thing then. That's better, all right. So there's been a lot of concern around that. The last debate on Monday produced a ton of concern around what were the falsehoods that were said, when did they stretch the truth, what's real, and there's been an explosion of fact-checking. And so my interest is not just with deception and not just with trust. You know, how do we judge somebody to be trustworthy? My group is also interested in how technology interacts with that phenomena of trust and deception. So in what ways do the many new ways that we all use technology to interact change the way we lie and trust one another? And we see, in addition to the concerns about deception here, we also see some issues around tech in this campaign. So this is a story that came online late last night on Politico. It's a group at the Oxford Internet Institute is looking at bot networks in this campaign and their operation, and they've discovered several patterns that are related to bot networks that support Trump. So whenever something controversial comes out that Trump has said, you see this activation of Twitter handles that probably are bots. They have a number of ways of trying to detect that then try to muddy the discourse, if you will. So we're seeing some fascinating changes in the way that deception can actually take place. And I'd argue what we're starting to see now is deception at scale in ways that maybe are kind of new to the deception world. And new to America in some ways. We've known about astroturfing, this idea of paying lots of people a little bit of money to change propaganda. But in the political world, it's usually been in other countries. So other places where it's easier to manipulate media markets. Here we're seeing it really at scale for the first time in the US in a fascinating way. Now it's also easy when you see this kind of report and we think about how technology can facilitate deception, that it's like, feels like this is really big and that it's really, deception's really happening a lot now. And that is a really common concern. But it actually is a really old concern too. So does anybody recognize this guy? This is Diogenes. Anybody remember their old classical training? What was Diogenes looking for with his lantern? Anybody remember? A what?
Human being.
A human being. Close. What kind of human being? A good man. Really close. What kind of good man? An honest man. That's right. So he was using that lantern to find a single honest man, and the sort of story goes he died without finding one. So not an uplifting story. But this is Greek culture, so several thousand years ago, and we can already see concerns that our current generation, in this case Diogenes, was more dishonest than prior generations. And we feel that a lot now when I give public talks. The number one concern that parents, for example, have is that the current generation is less honest than the previous generation. But you see that almost every generation going back that we've been measuring that kind of question. Everybody thinks we're more deceptive now than we were before. And it's not just Western culture. The first lie detection system was developed by the Chinese. They put rice in a suspected liar's mouth. And if they couldn't talk, then they judged that they didn't have enough saliva, therefore they must be lying. And this is about 2,000 years old. So both in the East and the West, this concern about deception is very, very old. Now, my interest in deception isn't quite as old. There's me in about 1996. I was a Canadian customs officer, and my job was to keep scary Americans with guns out of the country. Some of you, it seems like, maybe. In Canadian style, you can see that might look like my weapon there, but actually that was a stamp. That's how we do things in Canada. We have stamps to defend the country. And that was my first professional interaction with deception, where people were lying with me or potentially lying to me. And my job was to actually not trust people to try and decide whether this person was lying to me or not. And that's when I first got really interested in this, and it was a very humbling experience. So as a customs officer, you get to put people into secondary that you think are, suspicious. Maybe they have a gun, maybe they have too much alcohol, maybe drugs. And my success rate was really low. Every once in a while, I'd send somebody into secondary. They'd search the car or they'd search the boat and they'd find something, and that was really great. But many times there was nothing. And if you think of the flip side of me letting people through, I'm sure I let through people that were smuggling things. So this was a really humbling experience. It got me to start looking into deception. And at the same time, technology was taking place. You can see in this photo, there's a telephone behind me. That very year, they allowed boats to land on some docks, to come and dock at some remote docks, and call in and tell me that they were coming to Canada. No, I don't have any extra booze. No, I don't have any guns. And so all of this came together, this idea of deception and technology. I also tell you this story to let you know that I'm a Canadian, in case you can't tell from the abouts and outs, which means that in the discussion we're about to have, I don't actually have a dog in the fight. I can't vote. But I am Canadian, so I do tend to, lean liberal. We're still talking about universal health care. What? I mean, that's still an issue. So in Canada, we've kind of settled that. But we're going to be talking about two candidates a lot today. And I just wanted to be really upfront with you that as a Canadian, I'm not going to be voting, but I do tend to lean more liberal, okay? So just to be honest about my background. Now, when we think about all the concern of deception, one of the things I wanted to do was give it some perspective and look at how deception in political campaigns have taken place over the years. And so this is when I started working with CNN. We've spent the last several months working on a project that'll come out in a couple of weeks on CNN politics and CNN money. And I've talked to Jay, and we'll make sure that I get the link to you guys, so as soon as it comes out, you guys can have access to it. And one of the things that we wanted to do with this project was start to look back at prior campaigns to see if the sort of deceptions we're seeing now, we could see earlier. And it's very easy to think of presidential deceptions. Here's some classics. This is a deception called a categorical denial, where they both just straight up denied that something happened, something that they were personally involved in, but they were both presidents at the time. So we need to go dig a little bit deeper. And we can go to all kinds of different types of lies on the campaign. Here are ones about state secrets. So we have in 1960, Kennedy lying about the missile gap, where he argued that the Russians were going to be ahead of the US very soon on missiles, and after winning the election, within days admitted that that was not really the case. LBJ there saying, I'm not going to be taking American boys out to Vietnam, when in fact the administration had already made plans to do so. There's lies of the heart. So here are two candidates whose candidacies were sort of taken down by affairs. Gary Hart there on the left and John Edwards on the right. There's the humble brag. This is kind of a classic way of speaking on social media, but politicians do it too. So there's Clinton's 2008 claim that she landed in Bosnia under sniper fire. In fact, that wasn't the case. And Ronald Reagan claimed that he had photographed Nazi death camps. And there's a lot of evidence that he was actually in California at the time, and that was impossible for him to have done. There's another kind called truthful hyperbole in Don Trump's words, and this is where you say, like, oh, this other person's tax changes are going to cost us trillions of dollars, maybe $2 trillion, or my business plan is going to save us $1 trillion. And they tend to exaggerate the positive for themselves to the negatives for others. But that's not just for Hillary and Donald, that's basically every president ever running for presidency. And this brings up like a big problem for deception and trust research, and that is that, what is the nature of deception? What is deception? When you look at a lot of the fact-checking that takes place in journalism, there's very rarely a definition of what deception is. And part of that is because you can see there's just so many different types. I love this graph. It's by Ben Gibson. It's got truth at the top, lies at the bottom, but concealments and exaggerations, all kinds of different kinds of lies. And so what I think we need to do when we want to think about the way deception and trust operate presidential campaigns is get down to some of the intellectual aspects of it. Okay, so the first is we need to define what we mean by lying. It's really amazing to me how much discussion of deception and lying takes place in the media without any real discussion about what that is. And so there's many treatments of what deception is. I like this one. It's very straightforward. It's not, super jargony, and it contains two key elements. The first is the mislead idea. That's the core of it. The idea there is you're trying to create a false belief in someone else. You're getting them to believe something that you believe to be false. So that's obviously the core of deception. You need the intention part, because there's lots of ways I can get you to think something false, but it not be deception. So Jay could have told me that the talk today was at 10, and if he really believed that, he would have created a false belief in me, but not on purpose. He wasn't trying to deceive me, he was mistaken, right? So we need that intentional part. And that's where journalists, I think, often have the biggest trouble with calling a falsehood a lie. That's actually the real crux of the issue right there. Now, the next question we have to ask is, all right, once we have our conceptual definition down, how do we go about telling if somebody is lying to us or not? And to do that, I'm actually going to get everybody in the room to do an experiment with me. All right, so here's our experiment. Step one is we all have to choose a partner, okay? So I realize it's early in the morning. Hopefully you've all had some caffeine so you're not mean to each other. But choose a partner, and if it's somebody you've never met before, fantastic. All right, if you've worked that out, then the person with the lighter colored shirt, I want you to start thinking about a trip you've gone on recently. Now, the person with the darker colored shirt, I have a bit of a weirder task for you. I need you to close your eyes and keep your eyes closed until I tell you to open your eyes. So dark shirts, close your eyes. This is a safe space. You're going to be okay. Also, you'll recall I studied deception. If you open your eyes, I will find you. All right? So dark shirts, eyes are closed. White shirts, I have some instructions on the screen for you. Okay, white shirts are good. All right, dark shirts, you may open your eyes. White shirts, take 1 or 2 minutes and tell your partner about a trip you've gone on recently. Okay, start to wrap up your story. Get to the big climax. Sounds like some good trips out there, some good stories. All right, dark colored shirts, it's your turn to do something more difficult. So your job now is to decide whether your partner was lying to you or not. Okay, now this is called a non-interrogation deception detection task. So you have to just think about your conversation, think about what the person looked like and did. And I'm going to get you to raise your hand and keep it raised if you think your partner was lying to you. So hands up. Keep them up if you do. Keep them up. Good. This is a very trusting journalism crowd. I'm a little nervous. Hands up. Keep those hands up. All right. Here is the instructions. And keep those hands up. Keep those hands up. Those of you with your hands up on that side of the room, well done. You are deception detectors. Those of you with your hands up on this side of the room are mean and cruel, evil people. All right, take a second and debrief. It's weird to lie to each other. Go ahead. Okay. I hope everybody feels okay. Now, those of you on that side of the room that raised your hands, could you raise them again for me, please? All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people on that side of the room were correct. Okay? Could I have the people that raise their hands on this side of the room raise their hands again? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people here were wrong. Okay? Now, what this means is this side of the room did really well. Almost every team here, every black-shirted person in the room got it right. There were 7 or 8 wrong. That side of the room did terribly, right? You guys really, really were bad. Why? Is this side of the room just a set of better journalists than that side of the room? Why? What's the difference? Yes? We want to trust people. You know, if I were to summarize about 40 years of communication and psychology research, I could probably not do better than what he just said. We want to trust people. So the only reliable finding in every single deception detection study of the last 40 years is something called the truth bias. And it's a very, very powerful effect. And this room showed a really good example of it, okay? I'm going to dive into that a little bit more because I think it's actually at the core of trustworthiness, even when it gets to politics. Now, you all just did this thing where you had to decide where somebody was lying to you. How did you decide? What information did you rely on? What cues or signals did you rely on to tell if someone was lying to you? Just raise your hand and then shout out. Yeah.
This is my former student.
Excellent.
And I know
Yeah.
extremely honest, extremely ethical. And when he told his story on the trip, at the end of the story, she started shifting her eyes.
All right. She looks upset even now. It's true. It's good. So it was the eyes, shifty eyes. Great. Excellent. What other cues? It was shifty eyes as you go in the far back? Okay, so that's a verbal cue. He had trouble elaborating. Excellent. So we've got eyes, which is a nonverbal cue. We've got a verbal cue. What else? What else do people rely on? Yes?
I believe the story of the trip, but he said it was raining, so I didn't believe it was raining. So I thought
You have been living in California probably too long, I think. Rain has never been suggested as a cue to deception before for me. I've asked many people. That's very good. Okay, so it didn't seem plausible. So that's a verbal cue. Very good. What else? Yes?
Imprecision in language or slight.
Okay. So again, a verbal cue. Excellent. So in fact, there are roughly 3 ways to tell a liar. There are 3 sort of channels, if you will. There's verbal, which many of you, it seems like you relied on. Nonverbal, which are things like the eyes. And then physiological, things like the lie detector you see here, which examine things like heart rate, breathing, galvanic skin response. Now, the fascinating thing here is that one of my favorite studies came out in 2006. About 70 researchers went around the world and asked people how they tell if someone's lying in about 77 different countries. And the number 1 cue in most countries was the eyes. The eyes really feel like the window to the soul. Now, here's the crazy thing. The eyes are not predictive of whether somebody's lying or not. Okay? So we have that person there who shifted around a little bit. We have other people that said, I did not have sex with that woman, Miss Lewinsky, and they look right at you. So it turns out eyes are not predictive for humans. There is some computation vision work that's being done that suggests that the pupils do dilate for high-stakes lies, that blinking rates can increase under cognitive load. But humans cannot really rely on the eyes to do that. And what's actually really interesting here, and perhaps this is because it's a journalism conference, most people will respond with a variety of nonverbal cues. You guys almost all said verbal cues. And the research that's coming out of the last decade suggests that verbal cues are the best indicators of deception. Right? And in fact, even these physiological measures, at best, they get up around 70% accuracy. And because of that rate, which is higher than chance, but so much lower than what you would want to have if you were, for instance, in a trial, in the US, lie detectors are not permissible in court. Okay? So there is no technology that can always tell if somebody is lying or not. There is no 100% reliable cue. All right, so you guys did really well. You fit exactly what the meta-analyses of all the data suggest, which is that we perform pretty poorly as humans at detecting deception. We're about 54%, which is effectively chance, although statistically higher than that. There's a debate in the literature on whether that extra 4% is because there are a few people that are really good at detecting it, called wizards, or if there are a few people that are really bad at lying, like the example here of the young woman that started shifting around, those people are called transparent liars. And they give off all of the stereotypical cues, while most of us can lie no problem, okay? So we don't know, that's current debate in the literature, but the take-home story is 54%, which is actually pretty much exactly what this room did on your deception detection task. Okay? There was about the same number of people that were right over there that were wrong here. So effectively, you guys performed right at what you would expect from the meta-analysis. The other thing that took me a long time as a researcher in this space to come to grips with, and many of you will walk away today not really believing me on this, there is no Pinocchio's nose. Okay? It feels like, you know, when I give a talk on deception, everybody wants to know what are the cues to tell if somebody's lying to me or not, right? And it turns out there is no silver bullet. There is no cue that will always tell you if somebody's lying, even though it feels like there should be. And I'll explain in a little bit. When we use computational approaches, our approach now is that there may be very specific context of a certain kind of lie that we can look for cues. But there is no cue that will tell you if your boyfriend's cheating on you, whether that hotel review is real, and whether the president's lying about whether or not we should go to war. And it's because they're so different, why would we ever expect there to be the same cue? Another thing that's really important to think about when we think about deception is people don't just lie willy-nilly, they lie for a reason. And this becomes particularly important for politicians. And politicians are in a really difficult spot from a language point of view. Most of the time, they can't say what they really think because they won't get elected, right? And they can't lie straight out because they could go to jail. And so they have to fit somewhere in the middle of these. And so deception is typically a very risky pattern of behavior for a politician. And we'll see that there's some interesting patterns taking place now that might push back on that. And the last is what we talked about initially, the truth bias. It is the only reliable and consistent finding in deception detection research. We have a truth default state, which means that we start off believing other people, and we continue to do that until something makes us suspicious and pushes us out of that state. So the truth default is a very powerful effect, and a number of different disciplines are now coming to the conclusion that it's actually the basis of the way language works. So using words and implicature in the way that we do now, the way humans have evolved language, depends on us believing at the default that the other person is a cooperative partner. And when that trust is violated and the suspicion is triggered, it's very difficult to return to that trust default state. So corporations are very keen on this and their corporate culture. This is probably something that happened with Wells Fargo. But politicians, it looks like, also can suffer from this once their trustworthiness is impinged. And we'll take a look at that in a minute. Now, I showed you a bunch of deceptions that we'd found with the CNN project. And I would say that most of the ones that you look at that are taking place now in the current presidential election, we can find examples of. But there are a couple things that are actually unique about this election cycle, I think. And both of them are related to Donald Trump. Okay. The first is something called the attribution shield. This is a specific form of deception related to rumors. And it's a form of language in which you indicate something to be true based on what some other unidentified entity told you. Okay, so here's an example from Donald's Twitter. Many people are saying that the Iranians killed the scientist who helped the US because of Hillary Clinton's hacked emails. So this is a classic example of something called an attribution shield, which comes from the rumor literature. A more recent one is this. Well, now they're saying that I not only won the NBC presidential forum, but last night the big debate. Nice. And so you can see in both of those, these really nice shields. So the speaker shields him or herself from the claim by pointing to other people. We've been observing this for a long time with Donald Trump, ever since he started his campaign. So I spent a good amount of time trying to find instances of other presidents or presidential candidates doing this. And it's not very common for other candidates. And I'm not sure why that is yet. It's kind of a preliminary finding, and we're still searching. But I think it's typically that presidential candidates argue as if they know everything, right? That they are responsible for what they're saying. And in this case, this attribution shield use by Donald Trump does seem to be a departure from typical forms of deception. The other thing that's unique about Donald Trump is the frequency. So here's the PolitiFact scorecards. This is screenshots I took yesterday, so they're up to date. And if we look at the mostly false down to pants on fire, which are the bottom 3 bars for each of them, Donald Trump is at about 70% of all these claims are rated mostly false or worse. And Hillary Clinton is around 27%. And I've looked through PolitiFact's amazing database. They've just done a tremendous job over the last 6 years or so, looking at all kinds of candidates, Democrat, Republican, presidential, down ballot. And it looks like most candidates lie in the 20 to 30% rate, okay? So of all their claims, and politicians have to make many, many claims, and a lot of them get recorded, which we'll see is important, it looks like 20 to 30% is pretty normal. Republican, Democrat, going back 2 election cycles. So you got Romney, Obama, you can go to McCain, Obama, Clinton, and then you can look at the Republican candidates this year, Cruz, Bush, they're all in the 20 to 30% range in the PolitiFact thing. And so Trump is a significant outlier for the frequency. We can find no other candidate in their data set that comes anywhere close. He's 2 to 3 times higher than anybody else. And this seems to be another thing that's unique to this election cycle. Because I hope you guys are trying to get this. I like to frame things, both deception and trust, but also the changes wrought by technology in a longer frame. The chair of my department, Fred Turner, who's here, is a historian. So I don't go back as far as that guy goes, but I like to at least look back and say, hey, are these concerns like right now, or are they older? Because I think we typically suffer from presentism bias, pretty well documented bias in which we think what's happening now is the way it always has been, always will be. So for me to say that I think these 2 aspects of this cycle, the attribution shield and the frequency, I'm really coming around to believing that those are distinct for this cycle and this candidate. And last weekend, it looks like there was sort of a conclusion in the media where 4 independent news agencies all decided to use the word lie with respect to Trump. So 4 of them independently last week, right before the debates, released these reports. They tended to do fact-checking over a week's time. They found that, for example, Politico had him telling a falsehood that looked intentional once every 3 minutes and 15 seconds, while Clinton, by the same group, was telling one every 12 minutes. And their argument, they did this for a week during the primaries, is Clinton has stayed the same in terms of this rate, which again is typical of politicians, and Trump has gotten worse, so it's telling it more frequently. Okay, so again, I want to be really upfront with the political aspect here. I'm trying to tell you I do have a more liberal view, but the differences with Trump are pretty serious around deception. Now, we can then look at how these 2 candidates are perceived for trustworthiness. Okay, so it's pretty clear, I think there's compelling evidence that Trump has lied a lot more in the campaign, factually speaking, in a way that can be fact-checked. Here is the trustworthiness ratings. This comes from the ABC News Washington Post poll. It's a well-done poll. It has about 1,000 person sample. Theirs plus or minus 3.5%. And you can see they really aren't that different for trustworthiness. Okay? So we have Clinton in the top line there is the previous week. So is trustworthy, 36%, is not 60%. And Trump, a little bit worse, 38 to 57. They're pretty similar in trustworthiness scores. So we have a puzzle. The puzzle is that one candidate lies substantially more than the other candidate, yet their trustworthy ratings are equivalent. This is a really interesting puzzle. And I'm going to go through a couple of possibilities, none of which are conclusive and they're not mutually exclusive, that I would love to get your guys' feedback on. So, different rates of deception demonstrated, fairly conclusive, equivalent trustworthiness scores, both noticeably low, right? One possible reason is fact-checking just doesn't matter, right? Fact-checking does not matter anymore, or maybe it never did. And this is compelling. Several people have put this forward. We're starting to do a research project with one of my classes where we're looking at if people judge a candidate differently and whether they're being fact-checked live or not. And so I'll have some data for you soon, but not yet. But I don't think this is right. Instead, I think this goes back to some pretty serious changes in the way we communicate. And primarily that's how we evolved language. I think to understand the current communication environment, we need to go way back. Language for humans evolved at least 50,000 years ago, probably more. It's very difficult to tell when we first started talking to each other. Some evidence as far back as 450,000 years ago. But let's just say 50. There's good evidence that we've been talking for at least 50,000 years. If that's the case, then there's been about 100 billion humans over that period of time that have used language. Okay, so we evolved over that period of time using language in a way in which pretty much every single word that those people ever spoke disappeared. So the first writing, the first documented case of writing is about 3200 BCE, about 5,000 years ago. And what that tells us is that most of those humans never ever communicated in a way that left any record of what they said. Right? So they evolved language in a recordless communication environment. Everything they said disappeared. Zero record of anything they said. So we have some writing then, but printing press doesn't come around until about 500 years ago. And even then, hardly anybody could read or write. It wasn't until 1940, actually, 500 years after the printing press, that more people in the Earth's population were literate than were not. That's only 70 years ago. So most people never, ever left a record of anything they said. I'll ask you guys today, how many of you have written something already and it's 9:30 in the morning? How many people have written something? Right. So this room has already written more and left more of a record than than all of human prehistory, right? Before lunch. And that record is digital. So everything that you wrote, you probably sent to somebody else. And that somebody else can copy it, share it, analyze it, right? Send it back to you, edit it, share it with a journalist, pretty much with zero cost. So what I'm arguing here is that our environment of communication has radically changed. And it's only been about 10 years, maybe 20, that it's been like this. But it's already easy to feel like this is just the way it's always been. And for those of you that remember their evolutionary dynamics, 10, 20 years is not a very long time on an evolutionary scale. So I think we're in this fascinating flux period for deception, in which people now are leaving records that they never did before, and they evolved to communicate in a way in which deception just automatically disappeared. And now it no longer does. Politicians, I think, are the canaries in the coal mine on this. They've been recorded for at least 50, 60 years, everything they say. But even they are getting tripped up by this. And I think this change in recordability has profound effects on the way we lie and trust one another. Let me show you an example. Here's some people that left reviews about a hotel. And Many of you, I'm sure, have used reviews to decide where you're going to stay and where you're going to eat and which shoes to buy. Pretty much anybody that buys something over $100 now looks at a review before doing that. They're very common, and one of the reasons why is people can leave a record of their experience with a product for, fellow travelers down the road. Now, one of these reviews, my lab paid somebody $1 to write that never stayed at the James Hotel. Your guys' job now, my intrepid journalist crowd, is to decide which one. Let's see if you can beat the 54% by deciding whether A or B is fake. And I know that it's fake because I paid the person to write it. I'll give you a minute to read both. Let's beat that 54% against all odds. Okay, how many people believe that A is fake? Oh shoot, we're gonna be 50%. How many people believe B is fake? Yeah, it's pretty much exactly 50%. Okay, B was correct. B was correct. Now, those of you that were in B and chose B, what did you rely on to make your decision? Beautiful, yes. Actually, that is a good cue. Specificity. Typos, no. I thought so too, but when we've looked at it, typos is just a reflection of your spelling ability, not your deception. Damn it, it was a good one. What's that?
We knew as soon as we arrived.
Okay, and why does that trigger it for you? Necessarily know as soon as you arrive?
Yeah, the person says we knew as soon as we arrived is something that would be an artifact of experience.
Mhm.
It was to take more to imagine what would be striking.
Right, yeah, so there's good cognitive theory that suggests that our representations of events that we've experienced are different than those that we are imagining. So you're absolutely right in that case, yeah?
The personal pronoun?
Yes.
Mine, we, I.
Yes. So in fact, what we find in these is that people that never experienced the hotel used more personal pronouns. Me, myself, I, we. They talk about who they were with. And we've come to believe, and we've replicated this several times, that they're putting themselves into the story to make it seem more credible, right? And if you think about what liars have to do here, instead of describing the experience like she was suggesting, they tell a story. And stories are all about who and what. So you can see these people, they're talking about what they were there for, who she was with, whereas the other one was describing much more about what the hotel was actually like. Was it near shopping? So for example, prepositions were much more common in the real reviews than the fake ones because their bodies had actually experienced the physical space, and so they had cognitively represented the space differently, and that led to different reviews. When we created an algorithm to analyze these, so we're looking at M-Turkers who wrote fake reviews that we paid for compared to real ones, we performed really well. It could be anywhere between 80 and 90% with these algorithms. Now, would that algorithm do well at telling whether a president was lying or whether your boyfriend or girlfriend's cheating on you? No, not at all. And that's this idea that there is no Pinocchio's nose. There just may be some cues for a specific context that when we use computational approaches, we can detect. So let me, yes, question. That's a really good question, and we don't know. All we know is that person stayed there. So that's a really good question. So there's this notion of like when somebody says honestly or actually or to tell you the truth, that's somehow like different from a truth point of view. We've found no evidence of that. It seems to be an emphasis discourse marker. Like I want you to pay attention to what I'm about to say. And it's not like everything else I've been telling you has been but now I'm going to tell you the truth. It's more of an attention marker, it looks like. It's not related to truth telling, so far as we can tell. in the context we've looked at. Yes?
I don't know if you're gonna get to this, but I don't trust people who write to me and text. I don't trust things that have a lot of exclamation marks.
Yeah, that is actually, it turns out to be a cue in this corpus. Punctuation is kind of like the prosody of the internet, and our fake reviewers used more punctuation, substantially more. Again, if you're going to be like, I'm going to look at all my texts, and if somebody texts me with lots of extra punctuation, that is not an indicator that they're lying. If you're looking at a review of a hotel, and you're like, wow, that person's using a lot of exclamations, go to the next review.
Use one of these tests that work in a very narrow environment
Yeah.
with an 80% accuracy to test a person and then see this person, when given the chance, lied their head off, and now that tells me something about this person, which in other contexts I can then use that information to figure out that they're more likely to be lying in other venues that are harder to test.
Right. So I think you're getting at two distinct things, which I think are really important. One is knowing a certain person's sort of baseline behavior. This is the classic approach in lie detection, where you want to know, okay, how does this person typically talk? And then we're looking for deviations from that. And that's precisely what we do with individuals. Then does that individual speak differently in different genres or different contexts? And we're still at the very beginning of trying to understand that. Yeah. But let me show you guys an example, and then I'll take some more questions on this, because I realize this is, something that I wanted to share with journalists that are thinking about computation as a tool. This is one example how language can be used computationally. The Center for Public Integrity is a Pulitzer Prize-winning organization. In the mid-2000s, they put together a corpus, a database of every false statement that the Bush administration made. And there were 535 instances in which the top 8 members of the Bush administration made a reference to Iraq having weapons of mass destruction or links to al-Qaeda, which the 9/11 Commission found demonstrably to be not true. Okay, so these are falsehoods. And they identified all of them. And at the time, they could only say falsehoods. Now, history still is pretty short. There's decent evidence that there was some intentional deception there, but it's not 100%. We don't have the power of history to look at this. But some within the administration said, yes, it was false. Many others say, no, we were just misled with bad intel. But I want to show you how we can go about doing this in a sort of computational journalism way. So we rely on a nonpartisan, very good group of journalists to put together this amazing database. And as you can see, they highlight a sentence that was false. Now, the really nice thing about this is we can go in and take that language and put it into this bucket over here. And we take the language that's all around it, and we put it into this bucket over here. Now, what's great about this is we have 2 buckets, both produced, in this case, by Dick Cheney, on the same day, at the same time, on the same topic. One could arguably say that the only difference between the language in this bucket and this one turned out to be false, and this one turned out to be true. Okay? Now, if the administration was misled, then those 2 things should be identical, because they believed everything that they were saying in both the 2 buckets. If, on the other hand, there was some intentional aspect, remember there's 2 components to deception. If it was intentionally false, now there's a difference in the 2 buckets. And we can try and look at computationally what those differences might be. Theoretically, here's a couple of dimensions. We can look at many, but I'm going to show you 3 that we look at pretty regularly. So the first is first person, so me, my, I. Unlike hotel reviews, when you're trying to indicate that you were there, when people are trying to distance themselves from a statement, they tend to reduce how often they use first person singular. So a classic is something called pronoun drop. You've probably heard various candidates when they say something that you're like, wow, that sounds dodgy. They'll literally say something where the I should have been there, but it's dropped. Like, never bought those clothes, or never knew how much those clothes were. There's a classic Sarah Palin example of that where there should have been an I there and it's not. Okay? And you should see if these are false, first person singular going down in the false bucket relative to the truthful bucket. And that's exactly what we saw there, some evidence of psychological distancing. The next is this idea of leakage. So if you are feeling like this is something that's high stakes and anxiety provoking, which, taking a country to war is, then we should see some evidence. And this is called a leakage cue, and we should see some evidence of negative emotion. And in the black bar, that's our false bucket. We find precisely that. There was more negative emotion in the false term, that false sentence, that was in this bucket compared to the surrounding non-false language. And the last are exclusives. Look like I'm misspelling there, but these are things like but, except, however. They're a nice indicator of how complex some language is, and that tends to go down when people are lying. People tend on average in these kind of situations to use less complex language when they're lying. And again, this is a very specific kind of lie. And if there's deception in that bucket, then we should see that go down, and in fact we do. So my student Dave Markowitz, who's doing a lot of computational work looking at how lies are represented in text, has done this with a bunch of presidents. I'm not going to go through all of this, but to give you an idea that we can look at policy deception, like going to war. And it turns out that the Bush administration and Lyndon Johnson's administration, is that going to come up there? Here are very similar, right? You can see that decrease in first person. You can see the increase, or the decrease in exclusive terms. You see the shooting up in negative emotion, right? So you have a Democrat and a Republican, same kind of false statements producing the same pattern. Over here we have Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon. Sorry for those of you over there, but you can see that their pattern looks really similar too. Their first person singular goes way up, right? And this is partly because this is a personal deception, which they're trying to prevent personal embarrassment. The nice thing there is, again, you have a Democrat and a Republican, and their patterns look really similar as well. So the idea here is that we can use the records that now exist for what people say to examine that. So you look at hotel reviews, we've looked at online dating, we've looked at science papers that have turned out to be fraudulent. And fraudulently written science papers have a different linguistic profile than ones that are written based on genuine data. And it's related to this obfuscation idea. You can look at companies that have to make quarterly statements, and you see obfuscation differences there too. Okay? So a computational approach to this is an interesting way of thinking about how to investigate somebody's claims. All right, well, let's return to our puzzle. The puzzle was that the candidates lied differently, but we see very similar trust rates. Another problem is the power of homophily. We simply trust people that look like us and are part of our in-group. This is typically talked about as racism and sexism, and unfortunately those are true. We see this in many, many contexts. It's a very powerful effect. So even on Airbnb, black renters are less likely to be able to stay at a place. You see in resumes that people with black-sounding names are less likely to get interviews. Well, it happens in politics too. If that person looks like me and sounds like me, then I'm going to trust them more. It's a very old and very powerful intuition. And this might be a big driver of the demographic aspects that are driving the race that we can tell so far. Trust has less to do in some ways with the lying and much more to do with, does this person belong to my group? Yes?
Does it look like me, or does it also look like a president?
Yeah, I think that's another part of it. And that's this aspect of the intuitions. So there are differences in the way people look. So if somebody looks presidential, that's why they're always putting themselves in presidential spaces. Faces also differ in trustworthiness. So even if I don't say anything to you guys, I kind of have like a baby face. So you're going to trust me more than if it's somebody else that has more of that Neanderthal sort of big forehead and downturned mouth. So really great work by a colleague, Todorov at Princeton. He's shown that just looking at a face, he can predict whether you're going to trust it or not. So nonverbals play a really big role in trustworthiness. Yeah?
You know if that trust, what part of it is, I believe what he or she is actually saying versus I am not threatened
That's a really good question. Let me put that on hold for a second, because my fourth idea here gets at that. Yes? Yeah, many people perceive Hillary Clinton as having an agenda of hiding things, of,
Sorry, I meant gender.
oh, gender. Yeah, I think, this is one of the examples of, you look at males voting in this election, more of them will vote for Donald Trump, right? So yeah, I think there is definitely a gender effect here. Yeah. I thought you said agenda, sorry about that. All right, let's pop over to another possible explanation for this puzzle. And that's just a disturbing trend in trust in institutions. So Sunny Liu, who's the lab manager for the social media lab, and I are working on trying to identify more evidence of this lack of trust, but at the corporate world and management world, they've been documenting this for about 10 years. Trust in institutions in the US is at a 10-year low. So for about 10 years, trust has gone down. What are the institutions that they measure? Church, government, but also the media. And so it's 32%, and I can talk to people afterwards on how exactly they assess that, is the rate at which people trust institutions like the media now, like church, like government, like corporations. And so that brings politicians down, and it could be that, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are just bumping up against some ceiling effects of trust in institutions. And there's very little they can do to improve their standing there. That's a possibility. So there's a macro trend. And here's the last one. This is not part of the CNN project, because CNN, wanted to treat this as balanced and try to do as balanced a reporting as possible, which I completely understand. So they're letting me write an op-ed, and I'm working on it right now. And it's this notion that Trump is a bullshitter. Okay, now bullshit is a technical philosophical term, I promise. Harry Frankfurt had a wonderful little book called On Bullshit. I see many of you nodding. It's really great. Highly encourage everybody to read it. And bullshit has two key properties that set it apart from lying. The first is that with lying, as we've talked about in our definition, you're trying to mislead somebody. You're trying to get them to believe something that you know not to be true. Bullshit is actually not concerned with the truth. There is not a commitment to the truth at all here, right? And what Frankfurt says is that the crux of the matter is that bullshitters hide their lack of commitment to truth. And since bullshitters ignore truth instead of acknowledging it and subverting it, bullshit is actually a greater enemy of truth than lies. And so it's separate. Truth doesn't matter. And the reason I think this is interesting is that if you don't really care about the truth, which maybe Trump, that's the case, and your supporters don't care, it's not about the statements, it's not about the facts, it's not about the truth. It's about some larger message. We're going to build a wall, and Mexico's going to pay for it. And probably most supporters of Trump, if you ask them, are like, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. The main thing is we've got to stop immigration, right? So bullshit is like that, the story you tell about like that fish you caught when you went fishing, right? Part of the telling is the story, not about the facts. And so that might be why, if all this documentation of increased deception's happening, it doesn't matter, you're missing the point. The other reason I think that the bullshit idea is interesting is the second component. And this is a quote from Frankfurt. And it's interesting because, people have been diagnosing Trump from an armchair sort of point of view, and clinical psychologists are prevented from doing that, and there's good reason. Very difficult to diagnose somebody, say a narcissist, from a distance, right? And we've seen examples where people have done that with presidential candidates in the past and been totally wrong. This case, this is different. Trump has been very upfront about being an outsider, right, and not being part of the political aspects and not, knowing a ton of policy. I've been very upfront about that, and his difference is in preparation. And so it's interesting when Frankfurt writes, why does bullshit take place? And he writes, unavoidable. whenever circumstances require someone to talk without knowing what he is talking about. Thus, the production of bullshit is stimulated whenever a person's obligations or opportunities to speak about some topic are more excessive than his knowledge of the facts that are relevant to that topic. And I will tell you, as a professor, I've certainly had to engage in some bullshit when a really smart student asks a great question, right? So it's not like this is something that none of us have ever engaged in. Probably most of us have been in a situation where we've been in the need to speak about a topic we don't know a ton about, and we give it our best shot, right? So that's why I think this is kind of interesting. Now, to wrap it up in a way that I hope to bring some humor back to it, and we'll take questions for the next 10 minutes, it's just something fun, okay? So then there's a lexicon comes out last year on bullshit, and this guy just was like, I'm really interested in the word bullshit, and he went and found all of the synonyms for bullshit. And I kid you not, one of them is trumpery. And trumpery is very old. It goes back to at least the 1400s, and its initial definition or usage was around trickery and scamming. It broadens out to become general nonsense, and then it evolves to be things that are not true and also insignificant. And so it's just a funny sort of connection that I liked. But as we move on, I hope that his talk has been useful. I think it's really important to think about what deception and trust are. There's been a lot of scientific work done on this, but we tend not to delve into that. Everybody wants to know how to catch a thief, how to catch a liar. Give me the 5 cues that'll tell me how to do that. That is just not the way to think about deception. And if there's one thing that comes out of today's talk, I hope that you've come to agree with me on that. And I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you very much for your attention. Yes.
I'm really glad you got the answer. My question was on this last episode.
Yes, so the question is, are there some people that lie so much they don't even know they're lying? This is called self-deception, and I will tell you I was scared of self-deception intellectually for a very long time, till a guy named Robert Trivers wrote a book called Fool's Logic. So self-deception is a very powerful and adaptive approach to lying. So somebody that has engaged in full self-deception is very difficult to detect because they believe the lie that they're telling. So yeah, that's a very good question.
And is that the same as bullshit, or is it really different?
It's really different. Yeah, because that person literally thinks they're telling the truth. And again, a bullshitter just doesn't care what the truth is. They're just saying stuff and it doesn't matter what the truth is. Whereas somebody that's self-deceived, and we all do it to some degree, and there's some evidence that, super successful athletes are very good at deceiving themselves into thinking they're better than they are and they perform well. So it's an adaptive thing, but it's different than bullshit. Yeah. The gentleman right there.
Do you relate at all the amount of data and spatial ability to find life? That will know
Yeah.
to this understanding of trustworthiness.
Yeah, it's a really good question. The question was, is there something about the computational aspects of like all these records that are helping decrease the trust in institutions? And actually, I think the answer is yes. If we think back to any political scandal, personal political scandal in particular, over the last 15 years, almost every single one starts with an email or a text message, right? And it's because politicians say things in a recordable format that were either too honest or a lie, and they got caught in ways that we don't understand. And another evidence that it's not just politicians is in New York as of 2006, there were more divorce cases that included some form of e-evidence, email, text messages, than not. Right? So these records are becoming a huge thing, and the more records we have that we call out deception, that can lead us to see, oh wow, there's more deception than we ever thought. Yeah, good. You
Is there any evidence that practiced liars are more suspicious about lying than everybody else?
Oh, that's a really good question. So my student and I just submitted a paper, it's under revision, where the truth bias I was telling you about, we got them to rate all of their text messages, how much deception they did in their texts. And then we get them to rate a partner's text messages, okay? So we can say, this person lies quite a bit, because out of their 20 text messages, they said they lied 5 times. Then the really interesting thing is, do they perceive their partner as lying more or less, regardless of whether they're accurate or not? And indeed they do. So there's some sort of personal lens on the truth bias. If you lie more frequently, you assume that other people do too. They're very common psychological bias. Yeah. Yeah.
You went through 50,000 years of human history. Trying to understand what the implication is. People always behave this way, and now it's just captured in a format, or is it different?
Yeah, I think we're in a flux period of communication. I mean, one of the reasons that it's so exciting to be in the communication department at Stanford now, 2016, is we're right next door to Silicon Valley, where basically everything, even engineering and tech development, is all about changing the way we communicate. And I think we're in a period now where our communication is bumping up against radical communication environment transformation. And so we're in this amazing period of flux, and I think it's going to be disruptive for a little while. Yeah. Very far edge over there. Yeah.
I was just wondering, one of the things you could have listed, it might not be the right place to do it, but methodological problems could have been one of the explanations for a lot of it. And so, I know you've probably thought about it.
Yeah.
One thing that came to my mind was you mentioned that you had these two bins, things that turned out to be true, things that turned out to be false, and the assumption with the rest of the analysis was that the only difference between those two bins of statements is that one was true and one was false.
Right.
But actually, certain statements may actually be more likely to have been fabricated. There could be essentially hidden variables.
That's right.
And I can think of a lot of other methodological problems, especially anything involving surveys and polls. And so I was just curious, like, is that also on your list? And, how active is that part of your research?
Yeah, so in terms of the methods around deception and deception detection work, trust work is very difficult. One of the reasons is for work when we're trying to tell if somebody lies or not, we have to rely on them telling us the truth that they're lying. Big methodological issue. So one of the things we've really held on to now is this sort of historical approach of naturally occurring data. So that is, we know that some naturally occurring language was deceptive and some that was not, and we do that sort of two-bucket approach. And you're absolutely right that there can be other differences, and what we have to work on there are sort of choosing the controls as best as we can. With surveys, again, a big issue because there's these self-presentation biases. We want to come across as desirable and positive. And then the last major methodological challenge is getting people to lie. So I got you guys to lie. You performed just like all the hundreds of other studies. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Low stakes, it was sanctioned, right? You had very little time to prepare. So there's a limit on the kinds of lies we've examined. So I think methodologically, the scientific field, even though it's 40 years old, is just starting to move out of these problematic areas. Yeah, thank you for that. And Jay, do we have a minute more? One more. Yeah. Yeah, so I don't think it's possible on Twitter. And the reason for that is on Twitter you can talk about any topic and you can lie about anything. So I think that it's very difficult to do that sort of thing. And that's this other idea of like, what we're finding is that the context has to be very narrow and specific because the different types of, it's like saying, can you tell if somebody's telling the truth? But we can tell the truth about, N number of topics. So I think Twitter's not going to be a very easy space to develop an automatic deception detector. And if anybody said it would get above 60%, I'd be super suspicious, and because of that problem. So, all right, well, I have to wrap up. I'll be hanging out here, so happy to talk more about all those questions. Thank you guys a lot. You were a really excellent audience. Appreciate it.